Greetings, folks, and welcome to another episode, the 65th episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hasera, and for over 60 years, my passion has been everything about aviation. I'm a retired KC-135 pilot for the United States Air Force and veteran of 4 wars, and the author of the book Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit, where this podcast got its name. On this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit, I want to help you kind of expand your mind a little bit. I'm going to talk to you about some of the books that I have been reading or have read while I was teaching at the KC-135 Weapons School and as a curriculum director at the Joint Forces Staff College. I want to give you some sources of other people's lessons learned that you'll be able to pick out of these books that I'm going to give you today. Because I assure you that reading some of these books and hearing what these authors have to say will give you a greater understanding of how does the aviation world work and increase your critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. This episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show is brought to you by my book, Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit. And I've got some really good news about my book, even though it's been out for, going on 5 years now. Tanker Pilot gives you a behind-the-scenes look at air refueling operations in 4 wars, but more importantly, how does the planning and the execution come together for major air campaigns like Desert Storm, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Our show is also sponsored by Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. These are highly detailed profile graphics of airplanes from World War II all the way up to 5th gen fighters, printed on vinyl that you can peel off and stick to any flat surface. And we're finding out that the patches and unit emblems that I have done for folks are very, very resilient to the weather and to water. One of my good friends have had patches on his truck for over a year and they haven't even faded yet. So grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's begin the Lessons from the Cockpit show, where I'm going to give you an update to my reading list that I did almost a year ago. Many of you know I have a TikTok page. I'm almost at 100,000 followers. I think it was at 96,000 this morning and 4.6 million views, I think, something like that. And in TikTok, they have an instant messaging capability. And I noticed that I had a message from one of my followers, who happens to be a KC-46 pilot and also a graduate of the KC-135 Weapons School. So I click on Devon's instant message. What's this? He goes, got a good story for you here, brother. You need to go to this link. And so I do. And I'm pretty surprised by this, actually, because my book has been out for a while. Well, going to that link, and I'll provide this link for you down in the show notes. I open it up, and General Mike Minihan, the AMC commander, has published what he calls his leadership library. And it has a lot of great books in it. David Goggins, a fighter pilot about Robin Olds, The Bomber Mafia by Gladwell. Some really, really great books. Well, as I'm scrolling down, I come to what Devon was trying to bring my attention to. My book, Tanker Pilot, is on General Mike Minihan, the AMC commander's reading list and his leadership library. And I was thrilled and humbled at the same time that my book would be included in the section he calls We Are the Maneuver. If you haven't, my book is on Amazon in all 4 formats. Softback version does not have pictures in color. They're in black and white. And the Audible and Kindle versions have an extra file with the 32 pictures in it. I was stunned, to tell you the truth. What a great opportunity and a great honor to have my book in General Minihan's reading list, particularly under We Are the Maneuver. So good news last week about my book, which got me to thinking. As I was sitting there looking through his list, there were a couple of books that I have already recommended to you back in February of last year. He has Thud Ridge by Jack Broughton on his list. He also has Fighter Pilot by Christina Olds about her dad, Robin Olds, on that list, which are fantastic books. I have read Thud Ridge probably 3 times now, at least. It is the best description from the vice wing commander of an F-105 wing flying during the height of Rolling Thunder in 1967 when they were losing a lot of pilots. And Colonel Jack Broughton, who is the 354th Vice Wing Commander, goes through all of the problems and issues they were having, talks about the technology, talks about getting hit, where his happy hunting grounds were up near Phu Tho in Vietnam. It's really, really a good book. And I don't need to say anything more about Robin Old's book, Fighter Pilot. It is fantastic. I don't know how many of you know this, and I'm sure I've probably said this before. I spent 2 hours on the phone with General Olds when I was going through Squadron Officer School, and I asked him, I said, okay, tell me all of the deep, dark secrets of the Operation Bolo when they went and knocked down all the MiGs, and the Tai Nguyen steel mill raid when they went low level in the weather and dropped snake eye high drag bombs on the blast furnaces of the only steel mill in North Vietnam. I took 11 pages of notes, folks. It was probably one of the best leadership 2 hours I have ever had in my entire Air Force career. Listening to Robin Olds explain these two events and all of the problems and issues that they had, all the things that they had to do. The Tai Nguyen steel mill raid, that was the only 4-ship that was going out into North Vietnam that entire day, Plymouth flight. And he goes on to talk about all the restrictions and things that they had to do in order to get to the steel mill and get back. And he got hit hard. He got hit really hard and started leaking fuel. And he told me, he says, Sluggo, that's why a tanker guy never, ever had to buy a drink at the U-Bahn bar, because you guys saved our butts so many times. He said a tanker went up there, he's passing fuel through this hole in his wing, and a tanker went all the way up north and picked him up and literally drug him back to U-Bahn, leaking fuel out of his wing, and he landed. And I think he told me that crew actually said, hey, boss, we got to land here because we're out of gas too. And they just treated him like kings. Whenever you hear the motto of the tankers, nobody kicks ass without tanker gas, nobody, you understand from guys like Robin Olds and other 4 ships or 8 ships that were low on fuel, and a tanker shows up and gets them home that night so they can sleep at their own base in their own beds. Having your book on a 4-star reading list is a really big deal. And to have my book, Tanker Pilot, on General Minihan's reading list is truly a great honor. And I want to express my gratitude to General Minihan for putting my book and including my book on that very distinguished list. Like I said, it has David Goggins, Malcolm Gladwell, Jack Broughton in his book, and a whole bunch of others. And I'll put the link to his list in the show notes so that you can go take a look at it. What I want to do for the rest of the podcast is I want to give you an updated list of my reading list, books that I have read, books that I still have in my library. Now, there are a lot of great books out there. Don't get me wrong. This is just a short list to get you through Christmas, okay? There are a number of fantastic books that I would include if I was looking at like specific airplanes and so forth, like Buck Wyndham's book on the A-10, Dave Baronic's book called Rio, Tomcat Rio. Fantastic books, which you all need to have in your library. The books that I want to talk about today cover more events, historical events, and a lot of lessons learned are in those particular books. So let's just jump right into the list. First, I am going to once again stump the book Hunter Killer. I'm going to recommend to you a book that I recommended last year, and that is the book Hunter Killer, The Unmanned Air War. It is written by retired Lieutenant Colonel Mark McCurley, who was the commander of a Reaper Predator squadron at Creech. This is really a timely book for all of you to be reading now. All of you have seen in the news, the Russians have been trying to knock down our Reaper drones over Syria. They had one flanker run into one and bend the prop. Really good video of the bent prop that the DoD has released. And just last week, they tried to knock down another one with an Su-35, dropping their infrared decoy flares that they use to pull off infrared missiles in front of one of our Reaper drones, and it damaged it. One thing about the Russian flares coming out of this flanker, they're on parachutes. So they're in the air for a long time. And the DoD released video that shows this Su-35 flanker laying these things out in front of the Reaper drone so that it would run into them. And it did. They were able to get the drone back on the ground, but it was damaged. It damaged the prop and I think the fuselage or something like that. Like I said, the DoD has released really good video of that. And the other reason all of you need to read this book is because of what's going on in Russia and the Ukraine war. Drones are playing a huge part in combat over there. They're using these $400 quadcopters and putting explosives on them. They're dropping these things into the hatches of vehicles. There's a really famous video that came out about 2 weeks ago where it shows one of these quadcopter drones with explosives on it. I can't remember if it's a Russian or Ukrainian soldier sitting in the back seat. He's got his phone up and the thing gets so close before it hits the vehicle and then explodes, you can actually see the soldier holding his phone up, videotaping what's happening. They've used drones to drop grenades into the hatches of Russian tanks. They've used the Lancet drone as a kamikaze drone to destroy buildings, troop concentrations, tanks, vehicles. They've even got the Iranian Shahed drone that they're using as a kamikaze drone. And that's a really big drone too. So drone warfare is really beginning to come of age as we see drones being able to fly over the top of one of their AWACS airplane, a Russian AWACS airplane, and explode and damage it, taking out tanks. And of course, the traditional role of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, particularly when it comes to hunting the integrated air defenses of both Ukraine and Russia. There's some really fascinating video of surface-to-air missiles being shot at drones and missing. And the missile just goes flying by the camera. And you can see that on my TikTok page at Lieutenant Colonel Mark Acera. I've got a couple of them up there. And in some cases, these Lancet drones are hitting these SAM sites. And I've got one where an S-300, the Lancet hits the missile tubes and there's a massive explosion. The United States Navy is now using drones as tankers, the Stingray drone. It didn't start out that way. It was called the Unmanned Combat Air Vehicle, the UCAV, the X-47, which was a test vehicle, but they were able to launch it and trap it aboard aircraft carriers. And the concept that they were looking at was having this UCAV head out in front of the carrier strike group and start collecting intelligence and maybe even dropping 1,000-pound bombs on stuff. When I was working at Rockwell Collins, I wrote the white paper along with two other folks, Bruce Ray particularly, who was the lead engineer for it. And one of the requirements Northrop Grumman told us was it would be an optionally manned aircraft, meaning some missions it would fly with pilots in the seat, some missions it would fly with no one in the seats. And we had to design the cockpit data link communication system for the B-21 Raider as an optionally manned aircraft. Now, I do not know if that stuck. And I'm sure we'll find out more about that because its first flight is coming up. But think about that. The real limb fact for keeping an air vehicle up for long periods of time is the human factor, the person inside the cockpit. And if you can have something the size of the B-21 Raider, which is, I understand, a little smaller than a B-2 stealth bomber, have it unmanned and it can go wherever it needs to go as a low observable and either collect intelligence or drop bombs, that's really something. Please remember the three-legged stool I told you that all military operations hinge on, particularly from the air, all air operations hinge on joint integrated fires, meaning Tomahawk land attack missiles, bombers, fighters, anything that can shoot and put kinetics on a target. The second item is persistent intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, because as Sun Tzu says, that's how we maneuver. We have to have intelligence in order to be able to maneuver our forces. And the third is continuous humanitarian operations. And drones have been used for humanitarian operations. They've used Reapers over Haiti when they had an earthquake. They've used Sea Eagle drones off the back of cruisers when they were doing humanitarian operations in Southeast Asia. You're going to see more and more drones doing more and more operations and events. So reading Mark McCurley's book, Hunter Killer, The Unmanned Air War, must be required reading for you now because of all the drone stuff you're hearing in the news. Talking about intelligence collection, I'm going to recommend to you this book. And I've read this one a couple times now because it is so fascinating. The book is called Blue Moon Over Cuba by Commander Bill Ecker. Most books on the Cuban Missile Crisis are taken from memoirs of those people that were working around President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. This book is a first-hand account by the squadron commander of VFP-62, the Fighting Photos, flying RF-8 Crusaders on low-level missions over Cuba. Commander Ecker and his wingman flew the very first Operation Blue Moon, which was the code word for the low-level reconnaissance over Cuba. They flew the very first mission on the 23rd of October, 1962, and caught the Russians and the Cubans out in the open. If you have seen the movie 13 Days, you have seen a depiction of this particular mission. And this is the mission that Adlai Stevenson used the pictures to really poke the Russians in the eye in the Security Council meeting on what was going on in Cuba. Commander Ecker and his wingman, whose names escapes me right now, they took the photographs of the missiles, the bunkers, the equipment that was creating this ballistic missile site at San Cristobal. And now everybody's hair's raised on the back of their neck because they've got pictures of the site being built and the guns that are firing at them as they go across, taking photos of the Russians, the Cubans, creating these ballistic missile sites. It's really an amazing book. And when you read Commander Ecker's account of that 23 October 1962 mission, it just raises the hair on the back of your head because they're going supersonic. They're coming across the Gulf of Mexico, heading toward island of Cuba, low level, and they're in nasty weather. It finally clears out and they get their pictures, and they run these missions several times as a backup to the U-2 spy plane missions that are also collecting kind of the big aerial photographs. Well, Ecker's photos are close up and really personal. And his book, Blue Moon Over Cuba, is a definitive book, a personal account of what aerial photography and reconnaissance can do at the national or strategic level, operational level, and the tactical level. Really, really a great book. And I've read it twice now. It is really that good. Bill Ecker goes on to be one of the advisors to Kevin Costner on the 13-Day movie, which was made talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Really good movie, an even better book, Blue Moon Over Cuba. Did I learn a valuable lesson during the Second Gulf War, the Shock and Awe campaign? Because I had forgotten that one principle about joint integrated fires and persistent intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And this has a lot to do with this next book that I'm going to give you. Previous podcasts, I talked to you about tankers flying in Iraqi airspace during Shock and Awe getting fired at. And a lot of people upset at Sluggo because he's got tankers in Iraqi airspace and they're getting assaulted by things on the ground. Particular Toga 33, a KC-135 out of Bahrain, Sheikh Issa, got engaged 7 times in one night. Unfortunately, we found out 4 times was by our own guys, the Army shooting multiple launch rockets and ATACMs up through them. But we also learned that 3 of those 7 were in fact science projects, as we called them, air defense systems that Saddam had created because of the embargo on Saddam and his forces not being able to get air defense systems inside Iraq. The thing that I had left out of my plan was, of course, special forces. As tanker bubbas, we don't deal with special forces a lot. We refuel airplanes that are carrying them, and we're involved in a lot of their operations, but not when it directly affects KC-135 operations like it did during the Shock and Awe campaign. One of the methods that we started using to hunt Saddam's air defense science projects was integrating special forces that were on the ground running around during the Scud purge. Special forces had the task of looking for mobile Scud launchers that were in the western portion of Iraq. We began using them to also help find air defense systems that were shooting at the tankers or any other airplane that happened to be going overhead. And they were wildly successful. So this next book that I want to give to you shows how important special forces can be, not only in direct fires, joint integrated fires, but also in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And that book is by Gary Berntsen, who was the CIA station chief in Afghanistan at the very beginning of Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. Folks, this is really a fascinating book because it's the CIA perspective and how their Special Actions Division went after Al-Qaeda and bin Laden at the very beginning of Operation Enduring Freedom. This is Tora Bora, and there's a great story in there about one of his teams being in the mountains overhead Tora Bora, and they're just raining fire down upon bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda group. And they were up there in this mountain, unobserved, undetected, for I think like 52 hours or something like that. They were running out of battery power for their ground laser designator. They were up there incommunicado with B-1s, B-52s, F-14s, F-18s, F-15Es, just raining down fire on top of the Tora Bora complex. Seeing what was going on, having eyeballs on in real time, and then calling down fire upon Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. It's an exceptional story. And their call sign was Jawbreaker. So the book Jawbreaker by Gary Berntsen should be required reading for all of you because it gives a behind the scenes look at how the CIA and their Special Operations and Actions Division operate when they're out in the field, particularly when they're supporting an air campaign. Again, joint integrated fires and persistent intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. I'm going to use ISR from now on, persistent ISR. Again, they are in the mountains. They can be in the cities. They can be out in the oceans. The CIA special actions people, and they're all former soft guys, highly trained, highly skilled. And in this book, Jawbreaker, he talks about all the problems that they had politically, having to deal with Karzai and the government, having to deal with our own government, the CIA having to deal with the military, and all the challenges of supporting troops out in the field. He talks about the Carlo Ijangi prison riot where one of the CIA guys gets killed because there's this prison uprising of all these Al-Qaeda guys, and they kill one of the CIA operatives in the Ijangi prison. I recommend going and getting this book because if we ever go to war again, and I hope not, against China, or we get involved in the Ukraine-Russia war, the CIA and their special ops guys and gals are going to be doing a lot of the same kinds of missions that you will read in Jawbreaker, where they're raining down fire on some group, or they're just hunkered down quiet in some field or some mountain, calling in intelligence on troop movements and convoys and where high-ranking individuals are, because that's what they do. And Jawbreaker will give you a really good primer and background for those kinds of events that may be in our future. At the Joint Forces Staff College, I only picked up this book because I had a Marine sniper as one of my students. And this Marine sniper had been in both Afghanistan and Iraq. I wish I could remember his name. I know I've got it written down in a book that the class gave me. But he recommended this book to me. Again, this fills the joint integrated fires and persistent ISR categories of air operations. The name of the book is Shooter by Jack Coughlin. Now, I know all of you have read Chris Kyle's book, American Sniper. Incredible book, made into a movie. This book actually came out before Chris Kyle's book. It came out shortly after the end of the shock and awe campaign, maybe within 2 years, I think. Coughlin was, during the shock and awe campaign, the most prolific sniper and killer in the Marine Corps. And if I remember right, I think it was 93 kills. I can't remember. I have to look it up in the book. But he talks about how his leadership listened to him and a new way of moving sniper teams around to not only engage the enemy, and believe me, snipers can cause strategic paralysis in a company, a battalion, even a division, when people start falling over because of sniper action. But the other thing that he did was he created these sniper teams that had a driver of a Humvee, an intel officer, a sniper, and a spotter, a 4-man team in these Humvees ranging out in front of Task Force Tarawa. So they're not only engaging targets, they're finding targets too. Really, there's no better eyeball shooter combination, particularly where intelligence gathering is concerned, than a sniper team, because they look for small details. When they're doing their range cards, they're looking at changes in scenery, changes in buildings, changes in traffic, all of these different kinds of things that are extremely useful for gathering intelligence and being able to kind of tell what the intentions of some group are. So this book, Shooter, again, when I first heard of this book, this Marine sniper says, you really need to go read this book, Sluggo. I thought, really? But when I picked it up, I think I read it in like 3 days. And it's a quick read. It's maybe 300 pages, maybe a little more. But I was riveted to this book, particularly the chapter where Coughlin is now exercising this sniper team movement in Humvees. And there's a Russian colonel observing as they're moving around George Air Force Base. They're actually doing this exercise, I think it was in the old housing area of George Air Force Base. And he's kind of fleshing out these Humvee sniper team tactics. And this Russian colonel comes up to him and in broken English says, you, and he just points to him while Coughlin's like sitting on the ground. You very good sniper, or something to that effect. And you'll read about that story in that exercise, because that exercise helped them solidify how they were going to do this mobile roving sniper team tactic, which worked extremely well in Iraq. The book is called Shooter by Jack Coughlin. And again, I'll have a link to this book also in the show notes so that you can go right to it and buy it. Back last year, I did a 6-part series on Operation Anaconda, and this next author I had on the show. He has now published a book called Razor 3, A Night Stalker's War by Al Mack. I read this book in a day. It is an extremely captivating book. Al Mack, Chief Warrant Officer Alan Mack, was a pilot in the 160th Night Stalkers. And in his book, he goes through some of these crazy missions that he had to perform. One of those missions, he was shot down. And if you go back and listen to the episode with Al, you'll hear that whole entire story. He was flying Razor 3, the MH-47 that was inserting Britt Slabinski's SEAL Team 6 group on top of Takurgar Mountain, and had Neil Roberts fall off the ramp of his helo onto that mountain, which started the Battle of Roberts Ridge. There are a number of other great stories in this book from Iraq and from other places that Al's flown. But folks, I couldn't put this thing down. I am not a helicopter connoisseur. I don't know a lot about helicopters. I'm actually drawing an Apache and a Sea King as part of my wall pilot stuff right now. And I'm having to spend a lot of time with the two pilots to understand what helicopters have on them. Al Mack's book will explain to you how to get into the 160th. He talks about how he got screened for the 160th SOAR, and then finally becoming, I think it's most decorated pilot, and one of those guys that has the most experience flying with the Night Stalkers. I mean, just incredible stories, folks. So go out and get the book by Al Mack called Razor 3, A Night Stalker's War. And hear about, again, joint integrated fires. That includes a special forces team or special operations team like SEAL Team 6 on top of a mountain calling in fires, just like Gary Brinson was. But in the 160th SOAR, there's also what they call DAP helicopters, Little Birds, and MH-60s that fire rockets and shoot miniguns. A number of things that they do. This is really a great book, and it's timely because the Night Stalkers, as you can imagine, are probably pretty busy around the world right now. I would be willing to bet that some are deployed forward right now. I'm not going to talk about where. All you have to do is just watch the news, and you can imagine where. Al Mack's book, Razor 3, really allows you to see planning and execution cycle that they go through. Matter of fact, there's a story in there where he gets really, really mad at Britt Slabinski prior to the Takur Ghar mission. He goes through operations in Iraq and other places where the Night Stalkers have done their business. I think it's important for all of you to understand how the 160th does its business. And Al Mack's book, Razor 3, will give you that insight. Have any of you ever wondered, why was Top Gun created? What was the genesis of Top Gun? Why did we even need to have a school on aerial gunnery and tangling with MiG fighter? This next book gives you the harrowing story of why that school needed to be created. The book is called Scream of Eagles by Robert Wilcox, and he tells the story of the air campaign over North Vietnam and our abysmal kill ratio in the air, 2-to-1. I mean, it was terrible for a whole host of reasons. There's an admiral by the name of Frank Alt, who goes over to Vietnam and he writes a report about the things that are going wrong that need to be improved. And one of those real problems was we had left the dogfighting skill set behind. We figured, hey, during the Cold War, we're facing bombers. We've got the Sparrow missiles. We got Sidewinder missiles, heat-seeking missiles. That's all we need. And they began taking the gun off of airplanes. The Phantom F4 was created without a gun in it. Alt report goes through all of these issues, and finally, some folks in the Navy say, we can't go on like this. We cannot keep going on losing airplanes to basically a third-rate communist country. We're the United States. We should be kicking these guys' butts, but they weren't because training in air-to-air combat had kind of gone by the wayside. And this book, Scream of Eagles, tells this terrible story of the kill ratio over Vietnam and the creation of Top Gun in a mobile home trailer to what it is now. But more importantly, the immediate effect that it had on the air-to-air fight over North Vietnam, because these guys were fighting the real MiGs that we were fighting over North Vietnam. They'd acquired a MiG-17 and a MiG-21, and they were using those over the Nellis Range to actually show and train guys how to fight against those threats. Now, of course, as you heard on Rob Zettle's episode, that fleet expanded to MiG-23s during the last, 5 years. People have actually taken pictures of Su-27 flankers fighting F-16s over the Nellis Range. The story of how the Red Eagles came about and how Top Gun came about to create this skill set back into our fighter pilots is really a fascinating story. And it's covered in this book called Scream of Eagles by Robert Wilcox. There's a lot of great pictures that are included in the book, but the narrative of why that school had to be created is sad. We were losing a lot of guys, and the MiGs were knocking down not just Navy airplanes, but Air Force airplanes, F-105s, F-4s. Go read the story of what happened to Leo Thorsness, the lead Weasel pilot at Tak Lee, getting snuck up on by a MiG-21, and before he even knows the MiG's there, it's already sent a heat-seeking missile into his engine, and he's on his way down. The book Scream of Eagles talks about why we had to create Top Gun. And I love their motto, train like you fight, fight like you trained. When we were creating our weapons school, we had that motto printed across our foreheads. And our community in the 135 had very immature tactics that had never been tested, never been tried. And as a matter of fact, you couldn't try them in the airplane Kind of the same thing with the F-4. There's a lot of crazy quirks about flying in the F-4. And this book, Scream of Eagles, the creation of Top Gun, shows these guys how to employ the F-4 against MiG-17s and MiG-21s. Great, great book to read about why Top Gun was created, why we have these kinds of advanced schools like Top Gun, like the Air Force's weapons schools, why these people are so highly trained, and where some of those guys are now that created these great schools. This next book was actually published with a different name, but became a great movie. That book is called 12 Strong. It was originally called The Horse Soldiers. And this book is about the special operations team that's inserted into Afghanistan and immediately starts collecting intelligence on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and also raining down fire on people's heads. This is a great companion for the book Jawbreaker, because these guys were working in concert, if I remember right, with the Jawbreaker teams. I had a student when I was teaching at the Joint Forces Staff College that was a special tactics guy from Hurlburt, and I believe he was on one of these teams. And I remember him telling us this story. He told us that 2 weeks prior to the October 7th of 2001 kickoff of Operation Enduring Freedom, he was already inside Afghanistan. And I've not seen the movie, but I've listened to the book, The Horse Soldiers, and this is an incredible book. Because as you saw in the movie, none of these guys have ever been on horseback, or only a handful of them had when they were kids. That's how the Northern Alliance under Hamid Karzai was getting around. That gave them their mobility. And horseback was actually a pretty good way to do that. And, you know, there's the story about them playing the game with tossing this goat around on horseback too. 12 Strong is about this book of these incredibly highly trained soldiers who are in the mountains of Afghanistan and are literally learning tactics on the fly. They've never been on horseback. They've never operated in these high mountains like this. They're having to adapt to the battlefield, and they do it extremely well. And they're working with Dotston, one of the warlords, and he's got some really interesting quirks in his personality. And I remember reading a bunch of reports of people that had worked with this Dotston guy, and sometimes it was difficult. But again, there's only 12 of these guys. They're on horseback. They're riding through the mountains. They're collecting intelligence. They're doing all these things. This is really a fantastic book about how to adapt to a battlefield. We always say flexibility is the key to air power. And these guys are doing the Gumby thing when they're developing some of these tactics. You know, like the Marines always say, Semper Gumby, always be flexible. And these 12 guys were extremely flexible and adaptable on a constantly changing battlefield. Trying to hunt down these Al-Qaeda and Taliban guys, and of course bin Laden, but really having to develop a war plan kind of on the fly because they're doing things that have never been tested. They've got equipment problems because they're in these high mountain regions and their radios won't go over the mountains. They have very low coverage. There's just a whole host of things that they had to face, not to mention winter in Afghanistan. Nobody fights in the winter in Afghanistan. But these guys were called upon to do that. So if you haven't seen the movie, you know, go see the movie. I've not seen the movie yet, but this book, like I said, I listened to The Horse Soldiers. It's now called 12 Strong. Another great book that all of you should have in your library. The 12 Strong Special Forces team was calling in firepower from the air. B-52 strikes. I remember a story, I believe it was Hamid Karzai, who was listening on one radio to a B-52 crew and was actually talking to his Taliban buddies on a captured radio in the other ear. And I remember hearing the story of Karzai listening to a female voice come over the radio, and she is the bombardier navigator on the B-52. And Karzai kind of holding the radio up to the other radio, telling his Taliban enemies, they have sent their women to kill you, which to them is a huge, huge disrespect. But, you know, B-52s weren't originally designed for close air support. And a lot of the airplanes got re-rolled into things that they weren't even training to. And this next book is really the best primer for people, civilians that aren't around the military a lot, to understand how an air campaign is to be planned and formed and executed. And that book is called The Air Campaign by John Warden. Colonel John Warden was the commander of Checkmate. He brought over to General Horner the Instant Thunder air campaign plan, which, due to some personality things or whatever, got rejected. And the story is that Horner didn't like how Warden was doing things, and that can be read somewhere else. But then, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Deptula comes over and creates the air campaign. When John Warden was at the Air War College, he wrote this book as his paper, The Air Campaign Planning for Combat. This book gives you a really good foundational knowledge of what you have to have when you're planning an air campaign. The first thing he talks about, being an F-15 guy, of course, is gaining and maintaining air superiority to the point it actually becomes air supremacy, where you can do whatever you want over the enemy's backyard. Well, of course, in Afghanistan, they didn't have an air force. In Iraq, Saddam didn't even fly his air force. So some of the concepts weren't used. Some of these concepts kind of went by the wayside because of battlefield conditions and situation. But if you were going to plan a major air campaign, heaven forbid, against China or against Russia and Ukraine, this book will give you a really good primer on the things that have to go on, have to be planned, have to be done in order for an air campaign to be successful. It's interesting because he talks about like the 4 stages of air superiority, talking about how once you have air supremacy, your enemy is like a chained dog. And of course, he gives historical examples of this, which is the next book I'm going to recommend to you also. But this book, The Air Campaign Planning for Combat, was written a while ago, but truly is a foundational read on how air campaigns should be planned and executed. Which brings me to the last book, which is To Win the Winter Sky, The Air War Over the Ardennes in 1944-1945. This is really, really an incredible book. Because when Danny Parker wrote this book, a lot of these World War II guys were still alive. And there's 100 pictures in the book, just phenomenal pictures from this time period. This is the story of the air war that's going on over the top of the Battle of the Bulge. And you have to remember, the weather's not good. There's that scene in Patton where he asks the chaplain to pray for better weather, and the chaplain does. And finally, the weather clears out, and the Luftwaffe and the Allies really go at it. You can actually go online, and if you go to YouTube and type in World War II gun camera film, a whole bunch of it comes up, and it comes up from this time period where you can see the snow on the ground and P-51s, P-47s, P-38s chasing Me-109s, Me-110s, Focke-Wulf 190s, and vice versa. So this book is about the climactic air battle that happens during the late portion of 1944 into 1945 and the end of the war. The P-51s are devastating the Luftwaffe because Jimmy Doolittle is now the 8th Air Force fighter commander. And he walks into his office and it says, protect the force. And he's like going, no, that's not what we're here for. The fighter guys are to go out and kill and destroy the Luftwaffe. And he creates the orders that tell the fighter command, go hunt these guys down and do it ruthlessly. And this book covers all of that with interviews of many of the pilots on both sides that were involved in this. And of course, there's Operation Bodenplot, the 1st of January 1945, where the Luftwaffe is trying to wrest control back of the air. But the logistics behind trying to make this work, and now the Americans truly have the technology in the P-51. Bob Dorr wrote this article about the fighters and the engine change in the P-51. The P-47's got 1.8 miles to the gallon. The P-51 got 3.3 miles to the gallon, almost double. And of course, you hear all these stories about the P-51s just ranging over Germany, flying missions from England to Russia, landing in Russia, and then turn around and coming back the next next day. I mean, it's really an amazing air battle. And there's a lot of great lessons learned from the commanders and from these guys that are flying these missions in the wintertime and these climactic air battles over France and Germany, where we truly have what's called case 4 air superiority. The Luftwaffe toward the end can literally do nothing against the Americans. Best Luftwaffe pilots are all now dead. Their stocks are dwindling. The ME-262 shows up too little, too late, and the Allies win the air battle over Europe and subsequently win the war. There's one more book I want you all to go take a look at and read, and that is the Luftwaffe Commander's book called The First and the Last by Adolf Galland. This is probably one of the best books ever written by a very high-ranking air strategist, general officer, fighter pilot that has probably ever been written, other than Midway, the Battle That Doomed Japan by Fuchida. This book goes from the very beginning of World War II. Actually, I think it starts with in Spain, where the Luftwaffe is really starting to cut its teeth with the Me-109 and tactics and so forth. Werner Mulders, the guy who's the incredible tactician of the Luftwaffe, subsequently gets killed in a plane crash in bad weather. But Adolf Galland is the fighter general of the Luftwaffe who wrote this book. And he goes through the tactics, he goes through the airplanes, he talks about the different pilots, he talks about all of their lessons learned and lessons observed. The battle he has not only with Hermann Goering, but Dieter Peltz, and just tangling with Hitler over what the Me-262 really is. He says it's a fighter. This is a fighter. This is exactly the kind of fighter that we need. And Hitler looks at it and goes, nope, it's a Blitz bomber. This is not a bomber type of airplane, and Galland knows it. So this also should be part of your reading. If you're going to read To Win the Winter Sky, you have to read Adolf Galland's book, which is the counter to what the Americans are doing and all the problems he faces. A really, really great book on the air battles over Europe during World War II. The First and the Last by Adolf Galland. I had this in my list last year. It needs to stay in the list. If you're going to read To Win the Winter Sky, you've got to read The First and the Last also. Links to Amazon and where to buy these books will be in the show notes, folks. That's my list of books that I want to give to all of you. And again, alibis here. I realize these books are more about events. There are other great books by a lot of great authors like Bio Baranek, Buck Wyndham, so many others that I'll have in my next list probably in another year to go out and buy. But these are the books that I would be reading now based upon events that are going on around the world right now, where you have the reserves and guard being called up. Seriously, there are F-15s, F-16s that are flying in Poland with tankers, airlift, obviously, and of course, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance airplanes, the AWACS, the RJ, maybe even the J-Stars, I don't know, monitoring whatever's going on between Ukraine and Russia. And then, of course, there's still operations going on down in Syria because our drones are getting assaulted down there. And you'll have a much greater understanding of how the drone warfare works and how they plan, how they execute, what are the limitations of these vehicles by reading Hunter Killer. I hope you'll go out and buy some of these books or get them in Kindle or Audible, whatever, and listen to them. Or I've recently started listening to more books while I'm walking, and these are some of the books that I'm going to be listening to. In the future, I'll have more books for you. I'm also going to include later on books that will help you be more successful and help you change habits and help you change your lives. Dean Graziosi's great book called Millionaire Success Habits. Fantastic book. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode, the 65th episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show. I'm your host, Mark Hasara. This episode is brought to you by the book Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit. Now on the Air Mobility Command General Mike Minihan's reading list, as of last week when I found out, which is a great honor and great to see that. My book can be found in all 4 formats on Amazon: hardback, softback, Kindle, and Audible. The softback version has the pictures in black and white. All of the others have them in color. We're also financed by Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. Highly detailed profile drawings of airplanes from World War II all the way up to 5th gen fighters that you can peel off and stick to your walls. So please go out and buy a copy of Tanker Pilot, or go to the website wallpilot.com and order one or two of these great graphics for your walls. This and previous episodes of the Lessons from the Cockpit show can be found on my website at markhasera.com. I appreciate all of you tuning in and listening and downloading my podcast. We are very rapidly approaching 20,000 downloads, which is great. My goal is to have 100,000 subscribers by summer of next year, and we're well on our way to that. Please go out and buy some of these books and take a read, because they really do have applicability to the things that are going on now. Thanks, folks, for listening in to this episode from the Lessons from the Cockpit show on my new reading list. We'll talk to you soon.